So in order to discuss Parkinson's disease, we need to talk about the circuitry of the basal ganglia. Okay, so all of this information is found in chapter 18 of the textbook. And I'll skip around different parts of chapter 18 to try to pull out the information that we need. So, for example, there's a lot of information about saccadic eye movements, and we're not going to talk about that, right? We want to talk about the movement portion, which is what degenerates in Parkinson's disease. So, the first thing I want to define for you is what a upper and a lower motor neuron is, right? So, an upper motor neuron gives rise to a descending projection. That controls the activity of a lower motor neuron. So upper motor neurons are located in the cerebral cortex, particularly in the motor cortex. It's the area of the brain that's responsible for generating impulses that result in motor tasks, right, and movement, okay? And so the idea is these upper motor neurons receive input, and that input descends, right, down upper motor neurons to lower motor neurons, and lower motor neurons are the ones that directly innervate the muscle. So there's some ascending sensory information that goes into the brain. It's processed and then descends to cause some sort of movement if it's motor movement, right? And so you can imagine a stimulus that's causing voluntary movement. The stimulus is brought up, it's processed in the brain, and then descending impulses trigger movement, okay? So it's the nerve that innervates the muscle that's a lower motor neuron, but it doesn't directly descend from the brain, right? Typically upper motor neurons make synapses onto lower motor neurons, and that's what causes movement, okay? The basal ganglia do not project to lower motor neurons, even though they're in the brain. So they do not project to lower motor neurons. Instead, what they do is they sort of modulate instead. They modulate what flows into upper motor neurons. So you could think of them as the bridge between the sensory system and the motor system. Okay, and so the information that would typically flow across from sensory to motor will be modulated by basal ganglia circuitry. So let's talk about the anatomy of the basal ganglia, right, as it does play this modulatory role between sensory and motor controls. So the basal ganglia lie deep within the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, made up of the caudate and the putamen. Which collectively together comprise what's known as the striatum. So if we talk about the striatum, that's what we're talking about because they have a similar appearance. Striatum means striped, and so the caudate and the putamen on appearance look similar, and we'll see how they function similarly. But they are separate nuclei. The other component is a nuclei called the globus pallidus. Okay, and we can see them here. They're highlighted in this yellow-brown. Here's the putamen, and they're bilateral, right? So there's nuclei on both sides of the brain, the caudate, and then the globus pallidus. We'll talk about the divisions, the external and the internal segments here in a minute. This is highlighted in pinkish purple. Additionally, at the base of the midbrain is a structure called the substantia nigra. Right, and so what they've done is they've cut away some of the brain to show you here, right, this midbrain. And so the substantia nigra is both of these bands in here. And again, they're subdivided into the pars compacta and the pars reticulata, and we will talk about those distinctions, okay? So again, midbrain structures, right, little bit of neuroanatomy that you probably picked up in human A&P. The midbrain is part of the brainstem, continuous with the spinal cord. And so these structures are important and also included in the basal ganglia, as well as the subthalamic nucleus. Subthalamic nucleus right here. So everything together, right, makes up this loop, right, this sort of subcortical that is below the layer or the level of the cortex, this loop that links to the motor areas of the cortex and links it with the brainstem, which is where descending information travels, okay? We see activity in basal ganglion neurons before and during changes in their output, right? Before and during movements. So initiation of movement is triggered by the basal ganglia. Modification of movement, right? Responding and changing your movements is a responsibility of the basal ganglia. If any of these neurons in any of these areas that I circled over here start to degenerate, right, the system cannot simply switch smoothly between commands. It can't initiate movements. It can't cease movements, right? And so movement disorders like we're going to talk about, Parkinson's, Huntington's disease, tend to be problems with degeneration in different parts of the basal ganglia. So let's get into some projections to the basal ganglia, right? What's coming in to the caudate and the putamen, and where does that information come from? Let me clear this out here. Okay. So, yeah, we wanted to see where are these inputs coming from, right? When we talk about inputs to the striatum, remember the striatum was made up of both the putamen and the caudate, which got clipped off a little bit here. And so the so-called input zone right, is neurons from other parts of the brain, primarily the cerebral cortex. All right, so primarily the outer cerebral cortex, is bringing in information. And so these inputs are synapsing on a specific set of neurons called medium spiny neurons. All right, so neurons within the caudate and the putamen, within the striatum, those neurons, those specialized neurons are these, we'll call them MSNs, medium spiny neurons. Okay, these synapses are glutamatergic. They are excitatory and glutamatergic. Okay, and these axons, right, from the caudate and the putamen. I should have just written striatum. Caudate, putamen. They then project to the globus pallidus and the substantia nigra. So we'll do a bunch of abbreviating here. The globus pallidus and the specific portion of the substantia nigra that we'll talk about, the substantia nigra pars compacta. Okay, so that will be the SNPC. Oops, I made a mistake. Something didn't look right. Not the pars compacta, the pars reticulata. Okay. My apologies here. So what we can see, I think, from this figure is you've got different layers or different regions of the cortex that are bringing inputs in, right, to both the caudate here and the putamen here, right, mostly cortical, but not all axons are originating there. There is an important circuit that originates in the substantia nigra pars compacta, right, and so that's what we want to differentiate, right? So you can see this green neuron, right? This is bringing input up into the striatum as well. So I think that's worth noting. Not all input is cortical. Right? i.e., for example, substantia nigra pars compacta. Okay, and so this is where the basal ganglia is receiving input from. Let's maybe talk a little bit more about where it projects to, right? So I already mentioned this, but let's look at this in a little bit more detail in the next video.